A dirt-poor waitress had just 3 seconds to make her choice. Turn away as if she had seen nothing, or save the life of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Rachel Brennan chose the latter, and that 3-second decision tore her life clean in two. That night, beneath the weak yellow glow of an underground parking garage, she strained to drag an unconscious man, heavy as a slab of stone, through the rainwater seeping down from the concrete ceiling. She did not know his name. She had only seen 2 men in tailored suits inject something into him that rolled those cold, sharp eyes back into his skull, before they dumped him there like a discarded corpse. She had no idea that the man she had just hidden on the rickety folding cot in her run-down apartment was Caleb Marsh, the one this entire city dared only whisper about as the boss, the one who needed only a flick of his hand to make the most powerful men vanish without a trace. She thought she had saved a life. She had no idea she had just walked straight into a war whose price could be everything she had left in this world. And when he woke the next morning, amid the smell of antiseptic and the soft cough of a child in the next room, the man offered no word of thanks. His eyes swept across the shabby room with the gaze of a beast just snapping awake. And then he asked a question in a low, hoarse voice, cold enough to turn Rachel's spine to stone, a question whose answer would bind her fate to his, forever. If this story kept you holding your breath until the very end, hit that like button and share it to spread it to more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next dramatic, heart-stirring story. That question hung suspended in the cold air of the room, heavy and sharp as a blade pressed close against the throat. Rachel stood frozen on the threshold, both hands still holding the damp towel she had been about to bring in to wipe the stranger's forehead. She opened her mouth to answer, but her throat had gone so dry that no words would come out. The man on the folding cot slowly braced his hands and sat up, every movement slow and weighted, as though his body were still fighting against the drug left behind in his blood. But his eyes were completely awake. His cold gray pupils swept once across the room, taking in every detail, every exit, every cheap object arranged around it, before finally stopping on her pale face. He repeated the question, and this time each word fell slowly and clearly, his voice low and rough, yet carrying the authority of a man who had never had to ask a third time. Did she know who she had just dragged back to this rat hole? Rachel swallowed hard. She answered that she didn't know. She had only seen that someone was trying to hurt him, and she couldn't just leave him there. The corner of his mouth lifted for an instant. It wasn't a smile, but something colder than ice. He said his name was Caleb Marsh, and if she knew anything at all about this city, she should have turned away. That name struck Rachel's ears like a clap of thunder. She had heard it before, who lived in Chicago and hadn't caught that name in the stories people whispered behind closed doors. A name tied to rumors of abandoned warehouses and men who simply vanished from the earth one morning. The blood in her body seemed to freeze. Her knees went weak, and she had to grip the doorframe to keep from collapsing. The man she thought she had saved turned out to be someone even the police didn't dare say aloud. Caleb watched every change on her face, from confusion to horror, and he gave a faint nod, as if he had seen that reaction hundreds of times before. He said now she understood, and that understanding had just made her a problem. Rachel trembled as she asked what he was going to do to her, her voice breaking on the final word. Caleb didn't answer at once. He lifted a hand to touch the back of his neck where the needle had left its mark, his brow tightening as a wave of dizziness swept over him. But even in that moment of weakness, he didn't reveal a trace of fear. He was simply calculating. He asked whether she had clearly seen the faces of the 2 men who had left him in the basement, whether she had heard anything they said. Rachel shook her head, then nodded, then stammered out that she had only caught part of a name, that someone named Vane would be very pleased. The instant that name slipped from her mouth, Caleb's whole body went rigid. The hand resting on his knee clenched so hard that his knuckles turned white. A terrifying silence fell over the room, broken only by the faint sound of coughing from the next room and the rain tapping against the cracked window. Rachel sensed that she had just spoken something even more dangerous than the fact that she had saved him. Caleb lifted his eyes to her, and his gaze had changed. It was no longer the assessing stare of a predator watching prey, but something so coldly calculating that it chilled her to the bone. He ordered her to shut the door, pull the curtains, and not call anyone under any circumstances. Though his voice was hoarse and broken by the drug, it still rang with undeniable force, the force of a man others had spent their lives obeying. Rachel followed his orders like a machine, her hands trembling as she drew the faded curtain. When she turned back, Caleb had leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes, but through his clenched teeth he said one sentence that made her heart tighten. He told her that from the moment she pulled him out of that basement, her life no longer belonged only to her, and if she wanted herself and the child in the other room to survive this week, she would have to obey every word he said. That threat was still echoing inside Rachel's head when she quietly retreated into the next room, where the soft coughing continued to rise at steady intervals. And there, curled beneath a thin blanket worn threadbare at the edges, lay every reason she had never once allowed herself to fall apart. Lucy was only 7 years old, her tiny pale face tucked against an old pillow, but when she heard her sister's footsteps, the little girl opened her eyes halfway and gave a smile that made every fear in Rachel's heart fade for a moment. She whispered, asking who the strange man out there was, and Rachel sat down on the edge of the bed, gently stroking her sister's thin hair, as she softly said he was only a sick friend who needed a place to rest for one night, and he would leave in the morning, so she should just sleep peacefully. Lucy nodded and believed her sister the way she always had, because in the cramped and impoverished world the two sisters shared, Rachel's word was the only certain thing left. Rachel sat there watching her drift back to sleep, and in the darkness of the room, a whole stretch of her life silently returned to her. She and Lucy had been orphaned young after an accident took both their parents in a single rainy night, leaving a girl who had just turned 19 to carry a baby sister who was still almost newborn. Rachel had once had dreams of her own. She had once been an outstanding accounting student, the girl who always sat in the front row of the lecture hall, the girl her professors believed would have a steady future in the shining financial towers of the city. She had almost reached the end of that road. She had mastered numbers, balance sheets, and tangled streams of cash flow that ordinary people looked at and saw only chaos. But then that fateful night slammed every door shut. She was forced to leave her final year unfinished, tuck her incomplete degree into the bottom of a cardboard box, and step out into life with a little sister in her arms and a stack of bills that never seemed to shrink. She worked as a waitress at the upscale club, where wealthy people came and went, not because she loved the work of serving until her feet ached every night, but because the tips there were the only thing that kept electricity and water in this apartment, and kept Lucy supplied with medicine. Every time a guest snapped his fingers at her as if calling an animal, every time someone deliberately spilled a glass of wine just to watch her bend down and clean it up, Rachel gritted her teeth and swallowed it, because she understood that dignity was a luxury someone in her position couldn't always afford to keep. She endured it not because she was weak, but because every dollar she earned carried a face. The face of the little sister sleeping there, the child living with a kidney disease that forced her to go to the hospital regularly, the child Rachel had sworn before their parents' graves that she would protect with her very life. That was why, even with her heart pounding in terror because of the dangerous man in the living room, even with every instinct telling her to pick Lucy up and run, Rachel still couldn't do it, because she had nowhere to run, no one to call for help, and poverty had taught her that sometimes the only way to survive was to stand still and face what was coming. She gently adjusted Lucy's blanket, bent down to kiss her warm forehead, then rose with a quiet resolve forged through years of hardship. When she stepped back into the living room, she was no longer the trembling woman who had clung to the doorframe moments earlier. She was a sister, someone used to carrying burdens that seemed impossible to bear, and she told herself that whatever the cost might be, she would find a way to get the two of them through this storm, just as she had survived every storm before it. When Rachel stepped back out, Caleb had opened his eyes and was staring into the empty space before him, his hands resting on his knees, clenching and unclenching in a steady rhythm, as if he were trying to hold back a rage boiling up from deep inside him. She set the glass of water down on the rickety table beside him and asked softly who the man named Vane was, the one those men had mentioned, and why his own people wanted him dead. Caleb let out a dry laugh with no warmth in it at all. He said she had just asked the very question he had spent the entire past week tearing his own mind apart trying to answer. Russell Vane, he said, was the man who had stood beside him for 12 years, the man he had once trusted more than blood, the man to whom he had given the keys to nearly every door in his empire. His voice sank lower, each word seeming to pass through clenched teeth, as he told her that over the past 3 weeks, one by one, the most loyal men around him had disappeared. One had been sent far away for a reason that sounded perfectly reasonable. Another had suddenly asked to withdraw and return to his hometown. Another had simply stopped answering the phone. At first, he hadn't suspected a thing, because every departure had come with a flawless excuse. But now, sitting here in this shabby apartment, He could see the whole picture. Each piece had been quietly swept from the board by Russell before he made his move, so that when the real blow finally landed, there was no one left around him. Rachel listened with a chill crawling down her spine. She asked why none of them had warned him, and Caleb looked at her with eyes that were both exhausted and sharp as ice. He said that was exactly the cruelty of Russell's move. He didn't kill those people loudly. He simply isolated them one by one, buying some with money, threatening others through their families, making sure no one dared breathe a word, while each of them believed he was the only one being targeted. By the time Caleb realized the truth, he was standing in the middle of a desert, a king with no army left. He said the dinner party the night before was supposed to be where he met a few important partners, but in truth, it had been a trap laid in advance. The glass of wine in his hand had already been drugged, and the men he thought were there to protect him had actually been taking orders from Russell for a long time. What enraged him most wasn't being brought down, but the fact that he hadn't seen it coming, that for 12 years he had been feeding a snake right in the palm of his hand and had mistaken it for a brother. Caleb stopped, his chest rising and falling because the drug still hadn't fully left him, making every breath heavy. But his eyes burned with a fire that Rachel didn't dare look away from. He went on, saying that now he couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't call his lawyer, because that man might already belong to Russell. He couldn't go to any of his usual safe places, because every one of them might already be watched. He couldn't even step out through this door without fearing that a bullet was waiting for him. Rachel understood a truth that chilled her to the bone, that the only reason he was still sitting here, the only reason he had been forced to rely on a strange woman in a slum, was because she was the one person in this world with no connection to his life, someone no one could expect, someone no one could trace. Caleb lifted his head and looked at her, and for the first time, something almost like acknowledgement flashed through that cold voice of his. He said that, ironically, his enemies were as countless as ants, while the only ally he had left was one poor waitress who knew nothing, and he wasn't sure whether he should laugh at that or curse fate for it. Because she was the only person he could rely on, Caleb was forced to do the one thing he had never done in his life: place his fate in the hands of a stranger. He looked straight into Rachel's eyes and said he needed her help, not as a plea, but as a declaration, because in his world, people didn't beg, they bargained. He explained that within the next few days, there would be a meeting of the leaders of the underworld forces in the region, a council whose voices decided who got to sit on the throne and who had to be laid down. Russell was building a story that Caleb had lost his mind, that he had collapsed, that he was no longer capable of holding the reins, and if he didn't appear before that council with evidence exposing Russell's true face, then everything he had built would fall into the traitor's hands, and he himself would become a name wiped from the city's memory. He said he needed someone who could move around in daylight without drawing attention, someone intelligent enough to follow the numbers, and Rachel suddenly realized he had been silently assessing her more closely than she had thought. He had noticed the way she arranged things, the expense notebooks crowded with writing on the table, and the way she had immediately sensed that something was wrong. She asked why he thought she would agree to step into something that could get her killed, and Caleb fell silent for a long while. Then he said something that surprised her. He said he didn't think she would do it for him. He thought she would do it for the child in that room, because he had understood from the look in her eyes that she was the kind of person willing to do anything to protect her own blood, and that was something he could trust more than any oath of loyalty. Those words touched a hidden place deep inside Rachel, and perhaps that was what made her suddenly ask what had turned him into someone so cold. At first, Caleb had no intention of answering, but perhaps because his body was exhausted, because the night was so still, or because for the first time in many years, he was sitting across from someone who wanted nothing from him. He quietly said that he hadn't been born into silk and privilege the way people rumored. He had grown up in a poor labor neighborhood on the south side of the city, where winter slipped through every crack in the walls, and hunger was a familiar companion. He had once washed dishes for hire, had once slept on other people's porches, and he had built everything with his own hands from nothing through years he never spoke of to anyone. But what made his voice sink lower, what made his hand tighten again, was when he mentioned another name, his younger brother, Daniel, the only brother he had left in the world, the one he had sworn to protect. He said that many years ago, someone he had once trusted had betrayed him, had sold Daniel's location to the enemy in exchange for a little profit, and his brother had died in a trap Caleb should have seen coming. Since that day, he said, he had buried his heart deep underground. He had learned not to trust anyone, not to love anyone, because every time he opened his heart, someone had to pay for it with their life. Rachel went still. She looked at the man before her, and for the first time, she no longer saw a terrifying boss. She saw a human being who had lost so much that he no longer dared keep anything at all. And in that moment, a strange sympathy rose between two people from two worlds that seemed never meant to cross. Two people who both understood what it meant to carry someone on their shoulders whom they had to protect at any cost. The silence of shared understanding between them was broken by the tiny shuffle of footsteps across the wooden floor, and when they both looked up, Lucy was standing in the doorway, clutching a small plate with half a butter cookie on it, the one Rachel had saved for her from the night before. The little girl rubbed her eyes and looked at the strange man in the cot, not with the fear adults always had for him, but with the clear curiosity only children possess. Then she toddled forward, held out the plate, and said in her still clumsy little voice that if he was sick, he had to eat so he could get better quickly, because her mommy always said so. Oh no, her sister always said so. Caleb went still. Those eyes, so used to watching enemies and commanding an entire empire, suddenly seemed bewildered before a 7-year-old child who was solemnly waiting for him to accept half a cookie. He looked down at the tiny hand trembling as it tried hard to keep the plate balanced, looked at the pale little face lit with the joy of giving, and something inside his chest, something he had buried for years beneath a thick sheet of ice, cracked faintly. Rachel started to step forward to stop her, afraid her sister was bothering him, but she froze when she saw Caleb slowly reach out. The hand that had made even the hardest men tremble now gently took the half cookie from the child's hand, as though lifting something precious and fragile. He quietly thanked her, his voice hoarse and somewhat awkward, a word of gratitude he perhaps hadn't spoken sincerely to anyone in a very long time. Lucy grinned, showing the gap where a tooth was missing, then climbed onto the cot beside him and innocently asked if he knew how to tell stories, because her sister was always busy working, so there was rarely anyone to tell her a bedtime story. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know how to answer, because in all his life, he had never told anyone a fairy tale. His world had no room for gentle things like that. He glanced at Rachel as if asking for help, and she couldn't keep herself from smiling. For the first time since that terrifying night, a small smile, but enough to soften the tension surrounding the room. Lucy didn't wait for an answer. She began chattering to him about the stray cat that often came to the window, about the picture she had drawn in class, about her dream of seeing the ocean someday, and Caleb simply sat there listening. He didn't interrupt. He didn't show impatience. He only watched the child in silence, with a look Rachel had never seen in him before, a look so gentle that she could hardly believe this was still the same cold man from moments earlier. In that brief moment, inside this cramped and shabby apartment, a strange warmth slipped in, something Caleb had lost a very long time ago and had believed he would never touch again. The feeling of a home, of a child's laughter, of ordinary things that even his vast fortune could never buy. When Lucy finally yawned widely and rubbed her head against her sister's shoulder, asking to go back to sleep, Caleb remained seated there, watching the two sisters disappear behind the bedroom door. And for the first time in many years, he realized there were things in this world worth protecting not because they brought power or profit, but simply because they were pure and precious. That thought both unsettled him and awakened something inside him that he had believed had died long ago. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight slipped through the gaps in the curtains, Caleb was able to sit up. His face was no longer as pale, and his eyes had regained some of their natural sharpness, a sign that the drug inside his body was finally beginning to fade. He asked Rachel to tell him in detail about the place where she worked, and when she mentioned the club's name, a flash of recognition crossed his eyes, because that was exactly where that fateful night had begun. Rachel suddenly remembered, and in her mind returned the evening only a few days earlier, when the club had welcomed a special guest who made both the staff and the managers bow so low they nearly folded in half. That man had walked in, and the entire room seemed to stop breathing. The loudest people there suddenly lowered their voices. Everyone's eyes avoided looking directly at him, and Rachel had wondered then who this man could be, to make an entire crowd of powerful people shrink back in such fear. Now she knew. The man who had radiated that kind of authority, the kind that froze the whole room, was Caleb Marsh, the very man now sitting in front of her. But what made her shudder even more was that on that same night, right before everything happened, she had crossed paths with another guest, a gray-haired man dressed in expensive clothes and surrounded by an entourage, the man who had deliberately spilled a glass of wine on her, then loudly humiliated her in front of everyone, calling her a piece of trash unworthy of his glance, threatening to make her lose her job just because she had been a little slow, bringing a towel to clean it up. She had gritted her teeth and lowered her head to apologize, though the fault hadn't been hers, and she had swallowed that humiliation the way she had swallowed so many others before. As Rachel told him what had happened, Caleb's expression changed faintly. He pressed her with questions about the man's appearance, the way he walked, the people surrounding him, and the more he listened, the darker Caleb's eyes became, like the surface of a lake before a storm. At last, he spoke a name, and confirmed that the man who had humiliated her was not a stranger, but one of Russell's most trusted men, a crucial link in the network of betrayal woven around him. Caleb slowly stood up, and though his legs were still a little unsteady, his bearing had returned to that of a man born to rule. He stepped to the window, looked out at the city waking below, and when he spoke, there was no trace of exhaustion left in his voice, only the deadly coldness of a beast that had finished licking its wounds and was ready to hunt again. He said Russell had made a fatal mistake by thinking that bringing him down once would end everything, because a man's greatest enemy was not the strength of his opponent, but his own arrogance, and Russell had been far too arrogant when he left him alive. Caleb turned back to Rachel, his eyes shining with iron resolve. He said that from this moment on, every piece Russell had arranged would become a knife turned back against him. And as for the man who had dared humiliate her in that club, he said in a voice as smooth as velvet and as cold as steel, that man would learn the price of bullying someone weaker than himself. In his mind, Caleb began outlining each step of his counterattack, who he needed to reach first, where Russell hid his dirtiest secrets, and how to turn the board around before the council of leaders gathered. And for the first time since the night he had been betrayed, Caleb's eyes no longer held the loneliness of a man driven into a corner, but the gaze of a boss preparing to take back everything that belonged to him. But Caleb's plan hadn't even had time to move before the other side struck first. And cruelly enough, the blow wasn't aimed at him, but at the weakest person on this board. That afternoon, when Rachel went to the club for her shift as usual, she had barely stepped through the back door when the manager stopped her, his face evasive, not daring to look directly into her eyes. He stammered that she had been let go, effective immediately, and when Rachel stood stunned and asked why, asked what she had done wrong after all those years of dedication, he only lowered his head and muttered that the order had come from above, that he had no power to decide, and that he was truly sorry. Rachel felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. She forced herself to ask who had given the order, but the manager only shoved the last of her wages into her hand and hurried away, as though standing beside her for even one more minute was dangerous. When she stepped out onto the cold street, a luxury car glided up and stopped close to the curb. The window lowered, and a face she had never seen before, yet one that carried a cold authority, looked at her through the opening. The man in the car didn't give his name. He only said in a voice so calm it was frightening that she was an intelligent woman, and an intelligent woman should know when to let go of things that didn't belong to her. He said she had accidentally brought home a very dangerous object, and people like her, defenseless people with a sick little sister to care for, shouldn't get involved in the games of powerful men. His words were gentle on the surface, but every syllable pierced Rachel's deepest fear like a needle, because he mentioned Lucy. He knew about Lucy, and that meant they had been watching her, that they knew exactly where her fatal weakness lay. Before the window slid back up, he left her with one final warning, that losing this job was only the beginning, and that she still had a chance to let everything stop here if she knew what was good for her. Then the car rolled away and disappeared into the flow of people, leaving Rachel rooted to the sidewalk, her heart pounding violently and her hands ice cold. She staggered home, and all along the way, numbers kept rising in her mind like a haunting. This month's rent still hadn't been paid. The electric bill was already overdue, and more important than anything else was Lucy's upcoming treatment, which, without that job, Rachel had no idea how she would manage. For so many years, she had saved every dollar, gone without food and decent clothes, swallowed every humiliation into her heart, just to hold on to that serving job as if it were her only lifeline. Yet now, in a single afternoon, that lifeline had been brutally torn from her hands, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had dared to do something kind. When she reached the apartment, Rachel stood silently outside the door for a long while. She hurriedly wiped away the tears that were about to spill so Lucy wouldn't see them, drew in a deep breath, and forced a calm smile onto her face before stepping inside. because she knew that even if the whole world collapsed, she wasn't allowed to let her despair carve itself onto her little sister's face. But when the door closed behind her, and she leaned back against the wall, Rachel felt the weight on her shoulders become more terrible than it had ever been, as though the entire sky were pressing down on the thin shoulders of a woman who was only 26 years old, yet had already been forced to carry the burden of an entire lifetime. Misfortune never came alone, and only a few days after losing her job, early one morning, Rachel realized Lucy was more tired than usual. The little girl was no longer chattering the way she always did, but only lying there motionless, her small face so pale it made Rachel's heart tighten. She hurriedly took her sister to the hospital, and after hours of waiting that felt endless in the stark white hallway, the doctor stepped out with a grave expression and said Lucy's condition had worsened, that the child needed surgery as soon as possible before everything slipped beyond control, and that this was her best chance to have a normal life again. It should have been a ray of hope. But when the doctor mentioned the cost of the surgery and the treatment that would come with it, Rachel felt as if the whole world were spinning, because that number was so large it lay beyond even her most extravagant dreams, a number she wouldn't have dared imagine even if she had worked as a waitress for 10 years, let alone now, when she didn't even have a job. She sank down onto the cold plastic chair in the hallway, covered her face with both hands, and for the first time after so many years of forcing herself to be her sister's support, she felt completely helpless, like someone floundering in a violent current, while everything she could cling to slipped from her hands one by one. She thought about borrowing money, but who did she have to borrow from? She thought about selling the few poor belongings in their apartment, but even if she gathered everything together, it wouldn't make the smallest dent. And the more she thought, the more she felt herself being driven into a corner with no way out, where the love she had for her little sister had become a rope tightening around her throat. It was at that most desperate moment, when she stepped out through the hospital gate with reddened eyes, that a familiar car appeared again. And this time the gray-haired man wasn't sitting inside. He stepped out himself, wearing a courteous smile that Rachel immediately recognized as the most dangerous thing in the world. He introduced himself as Russell Vane, the name she had heard Caleb mention with all the fury in his heart, and he said he was very sorry to hear about the little girl's illness, that such a pitiful child really shouldn't have to suffer. Then he paused to let those words sink into her heart. He said he was the one person who could solve all her financial troubles with a single nod, that Lucy's surgery, the piled-up bills, and a peaceful future for both sisters, all the things she longed for until it burned inside her, he could give them to her immediately. Rachel stood frozen, as he placed before her the very thing she needed most in the world. And then she understood that this wasn't kindness, but a trap calculated down to every last detail, because he went on to say that in exchange, she only needed to do one very small thing: tell him where Caleb Marsh was hiding, what he was planning, and anything she heard from his mouth. He spoke in a voice as sweet as poured honey, saying she didn't owe that man anything, that he was only a stranger who had taken advantage of her kindness and dragged her into this swamp, while Lucy was her own flesh and blood, the person she had a duty to put above all else. He left behind a business card and a message that she had 2 days to think it over, and that sometimes in life, to save the one you loved, a person was forced to sacrifice one principle or another. Then he got back into the car and left, leaving Rachel standing on the thinnest line of her life, with her sister's life on one side and her own conscience on the other. For the next 2 days, Rachel lived inside a terrible struggle unlike anything she had ever known, Russell's business card lying in her pocket like a burning coal she couldn't bring herself to throw away. At night, she sat beside Lucy's bed and watched her sister sleep, listening to the little girl's weak breathing, while reason screamed inside her that all it would take was one phone call. All she had to do was reveal where Caleb was hiding, and her sister would be saved. She wouldn't have to watch the child fight her illness and hopelessness anymore. He was right, she told herself through tears. Caleb was only a stranger. He had dragged himself into danger. It wasn't her duty to protect him. Lucy was everything she had in this world. But every time that thought rose up, another image returned. The image of that cold man, gently accepting half a cookie from Lucy's hand, his eyes softening as he listened to the little girl talk about her dream of seeing the ocean. She remembered the story of the younger brother he had lost because of a betrayal. She remembered the look in his eyes when he said he trusted her because she was the kind of person willing to do anything to protect her own blood. And then Rachel suddenly understood something essential. If she sold him out to save her sister, she might save Lucy's body. but she would kill the very human part of herself that she had taught Lucy to cherish. She would become exactly the thing she had despised all her life, someone who betrayed trust in exchange for gain, and she would never again be able to look her sister in the eyes and teach her about honesty. Poverty could take her job from her, take her money, take almost everything she had. But there was one thing she told herself she would never let it steal, and that was her own dignity. By the time Caleb returned, after a day of gathering information, he immediately realized something was wrong with Rachel, and with the sharpness of a man who had spent his whole life among plots and schemes, he pressed her until she broke down crying and told him everything. From Lucy needing surgery, to the meeting with Russell, to the offer he had made, and the 2 days of torment she had just endured. Caleb listened in silence, his face showing no emotion at all. And in that moment, Rachel felt half afraid and half relieved, because she had chosen to tell the truth instead of secretly betraying him. She looked straight into his eyes and said she had refused, that no matter how important her sister was to her, she couldn't trade that away by stabbing a man who had trusted her in the back, and that she was sorry she couldn't give him an easier solution. A long silence settled over them. Then Caleb did something that stunned her. He stepped toward her and said in a low, hoarse voice that throughout 12 years, he had watched people sell each other out for a small amount of money, had seen how quickly loyalty vanished before temptation, and yet she, a woman who owed him nothing, standing before the chance to save her sister, had still chosen to keep her word. He said that was the most precious thing anyone had ever given him. And for the first time after all those years of burying his heart, he truly believed in another human being. Then he took out his phone, made a brief call, and turned to tell Rachel that she didn't need to worry about Lucy's surgery anymore. He would take care of every cost, not as a trade, not to bind her to him, but simply because it was the right thing to do, and because a child that pure deserved the chance to see the ocean. The trust that had just been formed between them quickly turned into action, because Caleb knew that to bring Russell down, empty words meant nothing. He needed undeniable evidence of the traitor's crimes, and that evidence was hidden inside a discreet storage warehouse Russell used to keep every filthy transaction of his buried out of sight. That night, after leaving Lucy in the care of a kind neighbor, Rachel followed Caleb to a warehouse district on the edge of the city, where long rows of containers sat silent beneath the pale moonlight. Caleb disabled the outer layer of security with the practiced movements of a man who knew exactly how the underworld operated, and when the heavy metal door slid open, an entire room packed with files, computers, and crates of documents appeared before them. Caleb could break in. He could handle every obstacle in his path, but when he faced the tangled sea of figures on the screen, even he had to shake his head and admit this was not his territory, and that was when Rachel stepped forward. She sat down in front of the computer, and in that moment, the woman who had once timidly lowered her head in the bar seemed to become someone entirely different. Her eyes sharpened, and her fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of a person returning to something she had once mastered. The numbers that looked to Caleb like a meaningless mess began to tell Rachel an entire story. She followed each stream of money like tracks in the snow, and before long, she began to notice the irregularities. She showed Caleb expenses cleverly disguised under the cover of fake consulting contracts, shell companies created only to move money around before vanishing, and she explained in a firm voice that this was exactly how people laundered money they couldn't explain. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture became. Rachel discovered a chain of regular transfers to names Caleb immediately recognized as officials, several police officers, and even a judge. Undeniable proof that Russell had bought an entire network to protect his dirty dealings. But what chilled them both was when Rachel traced the money back to a time many years earlier and found one unusually large payment tied to the exact period when Caleb's younger brother had died, a link showing that Russell's betrayal wasn't only happening now, but that his hands had been stained for a very long time, that he was the one who had pulled the strings behind the old trap that had taken Daniel's life. When Rachel looked up and told Caleb what she had found, she saw his face turn deathly pale, then harden. His hand clenched so tightly it trembled, and she understood that she had just placed in his hands not only a weapon to reclaim his empire, but also the answer to the pain that had haunted him for years. Rachel quickly copied all the data onto a small device, her hands working urgently while her mind remained coldly clear. She carefully erased the traces of their access, so Russell wouldn't know his data vault had been breached. Each step showed that she was not some passive outsider caught in the storm, but a crucial link, the mind that had turned chaos into a complete indictment. just as she pulled out the device and stood up, about to tell Caleb they had everything they needed. A shrill sound suddenly tore through the silence of the warehouse. An alarm began blaring, and red lights started flashing wildly throughout the room, signaling that their presence had been discovered. The alarm shrieked like an enraged beast, and Caleb reacted instantly with the instincts of a man used to living on the edge. He seized Rachel's hand and pulled her out of the room, his voice urgent, yet strangely calm, as he told her they had to get out of there at once, before every exit was blocked. The two of them ran down the pitch-dark corridor between the rows of containers, their footsteps blending with the piercing wail of the alarm. And only a few seconds later, from behind them came the sound of other heavy footsteps and shouted orders. The men Russell had stationed to guard the place had discovered them and begun the chase. Rachel ran with everything she had, her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest, but she forced herself to stay close to Caleb, who kept a firm hold on her hand and kept changing direction through the tangled passages. Like a maze he seemed to have memorized beforehand. Just as they turned around a hidden corner, two powerfully built men suddenly blocked the way in front of them, and without a moment to hesitate, Caleb pushed Rachel behind his back to shield her, then charged straight at them. Though his body still hadn't fully recovered from the drug, Caleb moved with the decisiveness and deadly precision of a man who had survived countless fights. Every strike was clean, swift, and exact. He disabled the first man in only a few beats, then turned and overpowered the second, bringing them both down with cold efficiency and not a single wasted movement. Rachel pressed herself against the wall, clutching the device that held the precious data tightly to her chest, as if she were holding on to life itself. Her eyes widened as she watched the man who had so gently accepted a piece of cookie from her sister's hand only a short time ago, return now to the true nature of a ruler of the underworld, and she understood that the power that made the entire city fear him was real. Once the two guards had fallen, Caleb didn't linger for even 1 second. He grabbed Rachel's hand again and pulled her onward, because the noise had awakened the whole warehouse district, and more men were already rushing toward them. They crossed through a side door Caleb had planned for in advance, and burst into the dark back lot where the car was waiting, just as a burst of shouts and several shadows poured out behind them. Caleb shoved Rachel into the seat, then quickly slid behind the wheel. The car roared to life and shot forward, while several pursuers still tried to follow for a distance. But with his masterful driving and his knowledge of every narrow street and hidden route in the city, Caleb gradually left them far behind, weaving through deserted streets, until the lights of the men chasing them vanished completely from the rearview mirror. It took a long while before Caleb was certain no one was following them anymore, and only then did he slow the car. Inside the cabin, there was nothing left but the ragged sound of their breathing and the pounding of hearts that had not yet calmed. Rachel looked down shakily at the device in her hand, then let out a laugh that was half relief and half panic when she realized they had made it out, and more important than anything, they had brought with them the one thing that could turn the entire game around. Caleb glanced at her, his eyes softening for a brief moment when he saw that she was safe. He quietly said she had done very well, that without her, everything in that warehouse would have been nothing more than a meaningless pile of paper to him, and that rare praise from a man like Caleb warmed Rachel in the middle of her trembling, even though she knew the road ahead was still filled with danger waiting for them. With the evidence in his hands, Caleb was no longer a fugitive. He began shifting into attack, and his first move was to find a way to contact the people who had once been loyal to him so he could rebuild his forces. But this was also the most dangerous gamble, because after being outmaneuvered by Russell once, he could no longer be certain who still stood on his side and who had already been bought. Caleb decided to place his bet on a man named Marcus Doyle, a man who had stood beside him since the earliest days, someone who had recently cut off contact and disappeared from every meeting, leaving Caleb torn between believing and doubting whether Doyle, too, had turned his back like so many others. He arranged to meet Doyle at a discreet location, and when Rachel anxiously asked what would happen if it was a trap, Caleb only answered in a calm, low voice that sometimes, to win everything back, a man had to gamble once, and he needed to know the truth, whatever it was. The meeting unfolded under unbearable tension. Caleb walked in with every sense stretched tight as a wire, ready for the worst. But what happened left both him and Rachel stunned. It turned out Doyle hadn't betrayed him at all. On the contrary, he had quietly withdrawn into the shadows the moment he caught the scent of Russell's plot, pretending to disappear so he could protect his life and secretly gather the people who remained loyal, waiting for the right moment to return and stand beside Caleb again. Doyle said he had tried to find a way to warn Caleb, but every line of communication had already been controlled by Russell. So he had been forced to stay silent and act in secret, and he had never stopped believing that Caleb was alive and would come back. In the moment, Caleb realized that amid a sea of treacherous people, there was still one man who had kept his loyalty intact. Something inside him loosened. He gripped Doyle's shoulder tightly, and that was all that needed to be said between two men who had once walked through life and death together. With Doyle and the loyal men returning, Caleb's strength was quickly restored, and now he was ready to collect the debts owed to him. The first thing he did was deal with the underling who had humiliated Rachel at the club, the man who was both one of Russell's links and a symbol of the habit of trampling the weak, something Caleb despised most of all. He had his people find the man, and when that once arrogant man was brought before Caleb, all his usual swagger vanished, replaced by the trembling of someone who knew he had angered the wrong person. Caleb didn't need excessive violence. He only sat there, calmly repeating every insult the man had thrown at Rachel, then coldly made him understand that the world he thought he stood above had changed, that the woman he had once treated like trash was now protected by a force he didn't dare dream of challenging, and that from now on, he would have to disappear from this city if he still wanted to keep what he had. The man bent his head low and begged, and Caleb merely waved a hand for his people to take him away, a punishment without bloodshed, yet enough to completely crush the arrogant pride of a man who made a habit of bullying those weaker than himself. When Rachel heard what had happened, she didn't feel a hateful kind of satisfaction. What she felt was a strange relief, because for the first time in her life, someone had stood up to demand justice for her, and she realized that Caleb's terrifying authority, when placed where it belonged, could become a shield for small and fragile lives that were trampled every day while no one ever spoke up for them. Fate seemed determined to test those two people to the very end, because the day the Council of Underworld leaders gathered to decide Caleb's future fell on the very same day the hospital scheduled Lucy's surgery. The two most important events in both their lives had been forced into the same moment, placing each of them on a separate battlefield where neither could take the other's place. That morning, the air inside the small apartment was thick with tension. Rachel dressed Lucy in her neatest clothes, forcing her voice to remain calm as she told her sister that today the doctors would help her get better, so later she could run and play as much as she wanted and go see the ocean the way she had always dreamed. Lucy lifted her big round eyes to look at her sister, then looked over at Caleb, who was standing silently by the door. The little girl said innocently that she wasn't scared because she had her sister and him beside her, and that pure sentence made both adults turn away to hide the emotion rising inside them. Caleb stepped closer, placed his hand on the child's hair in a clumsy but tender gesture, then told Lucy in a rarely gentle voice that she had to be good and strong, and when she woke up, everything would be much better. After taking the two sisters to the hospital, Caleb stood before the waiting room door, and this was the moment when he had to choose between two places where his heart wanted to be. On one side was the battle to reclaim everything he had built over his entire life. On the other were the child and the woman who had rekindled in him a light he had believed had gone out. Rachel saw the struggle in his eyes, and she was the one who spoke first. She said he had to go, that if he didn't appear before the council today, every sacrifice they had both made would become meaningless, that Russell would win and would never let them live in peace. She took his hand, her eyes red but her gaze steady, and said she would stay there with Lucy, that this was her battlefield, while the world outside was his, and each of them had to fight where they belonged. Then they would meet again when everything was over. Caleb looked at her for a long time, a whole storm of unspoken things in his eyes. Then he gave a slight nod. He told her that no matter what happened, she had to inform him immediately. He had assigned trusted men to protect the hospital in secret, making sure that not one of Russell's people could come anywhere near the two sisters. Just before turning away, Caleb stopped, and in a gesture even he hadn't expected from himself, he lightly squeezed Rachel's hand like a silent promise. Then he said he would come back. Not that he might, but that he absolutely would. When his shadow disappeared beyond the hospital doors, Rachel turned back and sat down on the long bench in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly together, and began her own battle. A battle without gunfire or fists, only the unbearable waiting and whispered prayers for the small life lying behind the operating room door. At the same time, in the car speeding through the heart of the city, Caleb sat in silence, his face hardened like stone. In his coat pocket was the device containing all of Russell's crimes, the weapon he had paid for in blood, and the closer he came to the place where the council was gathering, the colder and sharper his eyes became, because he knew that in the next few hours, he would either take back everything or lose it all completely, and this time, there was no way back for anyone. While Lucy had been taken into the operating room, and the light signaling that the surgery was underway glowed red above the door, Rachel sat in the quiet hallway, completely unaware that as she poured herself into prayer for her sister, danger was silently closing in. After discovering that his data vault had been breached, and guessing that Rachel was the crucial link who had helped Caleb, Russell had decided to make his final desperate move. He believed that if he could seize control of this woman, he would have a hostage in his hands to force Caleb to bow before him right at the council meeting. He appeared in the hospital hallway, with several of his men, still wearing his polished, courteous appearance, but his eyes now carried the madness of a man who knew he was standing on the edge of collapse. Russell walked over and sat down beside Rachel, speaking in a soft voice filled with threat, saying that she was truly an interesting woman, that she had refused his generous offer only to help his enemy dig up things that should have stayed buried forever. Rachel went rigid, but she didn't let her fear show. She only answered coldly that she wasn't afraid of him, that she had done what she believed was right, and that she didn't regret it. Russell gave a low laugh. He said her courage was admirable, but also very stupid, then leaned closer and lowered his voice, telling her that now she would have to come with him obediently, because if she made a scene in such a public place, it would only make everything more complicated. Then he hinted that he knew exactly where her little sister was inside this building. Those words made the blood in Rachel's body seem to freeze, but at that very moment, she suddenly remembered Caleb telling her that he had assigned people to protect this place in secret, and sure enough, just as one of Russell's men was about to move closer, two unfamiliar men came quietly from the far end of the hallway and stood between Rachel and Russell's group, making Russell stop short and realize that Caleb had anticipated this move. A tense standoff unfolded in silence, right there in the hospital hallway. No one dared make a reckless move because this was a public place, and Russell, furious as he was, understood that he couldn't act openly. He gritted his teeth, looked at Rachel, and said that this wasn't over, that even if she was protected today, it wouldn't change the outcome out there. But what Russell didn't expect was that Caleb, on his way to the council, had immediately ordered the car to turn around as soon as he received word that Russell had appeared at the hospital, gambling his entire future to rush back and protect Rachel. Because to him now, the life of the woman who had given him her trust and the child who had warmed his heart mattered more than any throne. When Caleb strode into the hospital hallway with a face as cold as ice, the whole space seemed to fall still. Russell spun around, and for the first time, a flash of panic appeared in his eyes, because he couldn't believe Caleb would dare abandon the fateful meeting to come back here. The two sworn enemies stood facing each other, and Caleb spoke in a deep, cold voice, saying that if Russell dared touch even one hair on Rachel's head or the child's, there would be no place on this earth far enough for him to hide. Russell tried to salvage what was left of his composure. He gave a faint laugh and said Caleb had made a fatal mistake by missing the meeting, that now the council would hand everything over to him. But Caleb only answered calmly with one sentence that made Russell's face turn pale, asking who had told him he would miss it, and saying that sometimes, to set a perfect trap, a man had to make the prey believe it had already won. As it turned out, Caleb's entire move had been calculated down to the smallest detail, because while Russell poured his strength into arranging the attempted seizure at the hospital and felt certain Caleb would be absent, Caleb's men and Doyle had quietly brought the evidence to the place where the council was gathering and delayed the session until the exact right moment. Once Caleb was certain Rachel and Lucy were safe under the protection of his own people, he ordered Doyle to secure Russell, then immediately drove straight to the hall where the underworld leaders were waiting, with Doyle's men dragging along a captive Russell, who had gone rigid with shock as he realized he had fallen into the very trap he had thought he was setting. The hall was a vast room where the most powerful men in the region's underworld sat around a long table, and when the heavy doors flew open, every pair of eyes turned toward Caleb as he strode in with the presence of a king returning to reclaim his throne, with no trace left of the man who had once been abandoned in a parking basement. Russell, escorted behind him, tried to salvage the situation by loudly accusing Caleb of having lost his mind, of no longer being clear-headed enough to lead, of being unfit to hold power, and claiming that he himself was the one who deserved to take over. A few council members who had already been influenced by Russell began to murmur, but Caleb wasn't shaken. He stepped into the center of the room, placed the device containing the data on the table, and began projecting everything Rachel had decoded. Every stream of dirty money, every bribe, every name of a bought official and police officer appearing one after another before the entire council. His voice rang out, cold and powerful, as he exposed that the true traitor was none other than Russell Vane, the man who had quietly purged loyal people, the man who had drugged him and brought him down to steal power. And most important of all, he pointed to the old payment Rachel had uncovered and said each word with weight, declaring that Russell was the one behind his younger brother's death all those years ago. The whole hall was shaken. The murmurs from moments earlier turned into outrage, because in their world, no matter how ruthless they were, betrayal from within and stabbing a brother in the back remained sins that couldn't be forgiven. Russell felt the board had turned completely against him. In panic, he shouted that all of it was fake, that Caleb had staged everything to frame him, and in desperation, he recklessly lunged for the device on the table, trying to destroy the evidence. But Caleb had already anticipated that desperate move. In one decisive motion, he stopped Russell's hand, subdued him with cold control, and without a single wasted movement, forcing him down right in front of the entire council. Russell's resistance died out when several other leaders also rose to their feet, their eyes already delivering the verdict. One of the oldest leaders, a man respected by the entire council, slowly stood and declared that the truth was far too clear, that Russell Vane had committed the most forbidden offense and would face consequences worthy of it, while also affirming that Caleb remained the only man worthy of holding his position. Russell was escorted away under the contemptuous eyes of everyone present, all the power and schemes he had spent years building collapsing into ruins in a single moment, and when he looked back at Caleb, with eyes filled with hatred and disbelief, Caleb only answered with the calm gaze of a man who had reclaimed justice for his dead brother, a punishment that needed no blood and still crushed completely the one who had caused so much pain. As soon as everything at the council had been settled and Russell was escorted away, Caleb didn't linger for even one more second to savor his victory. He immediately rushed out of the hall, with only one thought left in his mind, that he had to return to Rachel and Lucy, because to him, now, the throne he had just reclaimed was not as important as news from that operating room. At the same time, at the hospital, Rachel was still sitting in the hallway with her hands clasped tightly together. The red light above the operating room door had been glowing for hours that felt as long as an entire lifetime, and every minute that passed was another minute her heart was crushed between hope and fear. She had prayed until she had no words left, had remembered every smile, every innocent little sentence her sister had ever spoken, and she told herself that if there was any miracle in this world, then please let it be given to the small child fighting behind that door. At the very moment, Caleb strode down the hospital hallway and caught Rachel's eyes. The operating room door slowly opened, and the doctor stepped out, pulling down his mask to reveal a tired but warm smile. He said the surgery had gone very well, that Lucy had made it through the most dangerous moment and would now slowly recover, that with proper care, she would be able to live a healthy and normal life like other children. For 1 second, Rachel stood frozen, as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. Then, when those words truly sank into her mind, she broke down sobbing. But these tears were completely different from every tear she had shed over all the years before. These were tears of overwhelming relief, of a happiness she had never dared dream of. Her legs gave way from exhaustion and emotion, and Caleb was the one who stepped forward in time to catch her, letting her lean against him and cry out the burden that had been pressing down on her shoulders for far too long. He said nothing. He only quietly wrapped his arms around her and held her steady. And in those arms, for the first time after all those years of forcing herself to be the support for someone else, Rachel allowed herself to be weak, allowed herself to lean on someone. When the wave of emotion finally eased, Rachel lifted her face to look at Caleb, and through her tears, she asked whether everything outside was all right, whether he had taken back what belonged to him. Caleb gave a slight nod. He told her that Russell had paid for everything he had done, that justice had finally been carried out, not only for him, but also for the younger brother he had lost so many years ago. The two of them stood there in the hospital hallway, one having just reclaimed an entire empire, the other having just kept the most precious life in her world, and they realized that the two battlefields that had seemed separate had, in truth, always been bound tightly together, because neither person's victory could be complete without the other. A little later, when they were allowed to visit, Rachel stepped softly to the hospital bed where Lucy lay sleeping peacefully. The little girl's face was still pale, but the exhausted, painful look of the past few days had faded, replaced by the calm of a deep and restful sleep. Caleb stood silently behind them, watching the two sisters with an emotion rising powerfully inside his chest, and he quietly realized that the small home he had accidentally stepped into on that fateful night had now become the thing he wanted to protect more than anything else in the world. The days that followed passed like a gentle new chapter in Rachel's life, a life that had known almost nothing but storms, because Caleb, now with his power and position fully restored, quietly arranged everything to make sure the two sisters would never again have to live in want or fear. He took care of all the costs for Lucy's treatment and recovery, making certain the little girl was cared for by the best doctors, but he did it all quietly and with care, never turning it into a favor that Rachel had to be grateful for or feel indebted to him over. When Rachel shyly said she didn't know when she would ever be able to repay everything he had done for her and her sister, Caleb only shook his head and answered in a warm, low voice that she was the one who had given him far more, because on the night she pulled him out of that basement, she hadn't only saved his life, she had also saved something inside him that had been dead for a very long time. He admitted that for years, he had lived like a cold shadow, believing neither in kindness nor in the existence of people who were willing to give without calculation, until he met her, a woman who had nothing in her hands except an honest heart, yet still dared to refuse an entire fortune in order to keep her conscience intact. He said she had taught him something that a lifetime of fighting in the underworld had never been able to teach him. That a person's dignity wasn't found in how much power or money they had, but in what they managed to hold on to when they were driven into a corner. Between the two of them, a feeling had quietly begun to grow without either of them knowing exactly when it had started. It wasn't a love that burned in haste, but a bond nurtured through the dangers they had survived together, through the vulnerable moments they had shared, through the silent understanding between two people who had once believed they would be alone until the end of their lives. There were afternoons when Caleb came by the small apartment, now repaired and made warmer, and sat quietly listening to Lucy talk about school, and Rachel realized that the man who had once made the whole city tremble had found peace in the very simple things he had never had. Once, when the two of them stood together by the window, looking out at the city as its lights came on while Lucy slept deeply, Caleb turned slightly and looked at Rachel for a long time. His eyes no longer held the icy sharpness of a boss, but the warm gaze of a man cherishing the precious thing before him. He quietly said that all his life, he had been used to people coming to him out of fear or for profit, and he had never known what it felt like to have someone look at him as an ordinary human being, until she appeared. Rachel looked up, her heart beating with a rhythm she had thought she could no longer feel after so many years, and she answered that she, too, had never thought she would find a place to lean on in the middle of this difficult life. Neither of them rushed to name the feeling that was slowly growing between them, because both understood that some precious things needed to be held gently and allowed to bloom in their own time. But in the moment his hand lightly touched hers beside that window, both of them silently knew that a new door had opened, a beginning that two people who had suffered too much loss now deserved to receive. After everything they had gone through to find each other, many months passed. The harsh winter of that year had given way to warmer days, and Rachel now stood on a windswept beach, watching Lucy run and skip across the sand with color blooming again in her cheeks, her bright laughter mingling with the sound of waves breaking against the shore, just like the innocent dream she had once told a strange man about on that fateful night. Caleb stood beside Rachel, no longer the cold boss the whole city feared, but simply a man who had found peace beside the people he loved. And as he watched the two sisters play, a true smile appeared on that face once hardened by schemes and loss, the kind of smile money and power had never been able to buy for him. Their story, a poor waitress and a powerful boss, two people who seemed separated by an abyss, had brought them together and allowed them to save each other, not through wealth or status, but through the simplest kindness and honesty of the human heart. And that is also the message this story wants to leave behind. That a person's dignity is never measured by the money in their pocket or the position they hold in society, but by the choices they dare to make when they are driven into a corner, by whether they can still hold on to kindness and honesty when everything pushes them to surrender. Rachel could have sold out her conscience in exchange for an easy escape, but she chose to keep her dignity, and that choice not only did not cost her everything, it also brought her a new life, a home, and a love she had never dared dream of. Life will sometimes test us with the cruelest circumstances, But always remember that kindness given from the heart is never meaningless, and even the smallest act of goodness can light a flame that changes an entire life, both for the person who receives it and for the person who gives it. If this story has touched your heart and left you with something to reflect on, please press the like button and share this video with more people, and subscribe to our channel so that every day you can listen to more meaningful stories that stir the soul. We would truly love to know how you feel about the story you have just heard, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment sharing the deepest emotions in your heart, because every word you share is a precious source of encouragement for us. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, live in peace, and be filled with joy in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next stories.